Hey, welcome back, grade 12s. So we're going to start a new unit. Now we're all done genetics, and we're going to be moving on to metabolic processes. So brand new unit. We'll probably be in this for, I'm thinking, probably about a month, and then we'll end up with our homeostasis unit. Okay, so recall that living things are constantly performing reactions inside their body, largely controlled by enzymes. Remember, enzymes are just proteins, and that's how we can kind of control our reactions. We turn them on and off with enzymes. Now, these reactions sometimes involve the breakdown of something, like breaking down food into macromolecules. So you eat a piece of, say, steak, and then you start breaking it down into the protein and then the lipids that are inside it. So some of these reactions are breakdown. But other reactions, we actually build things up, like something like creating a new DNA strand during replication. Like you took a bunch of bases and you assembled them into DNA. So you actually build things like that. Or sometimes when we build a new cell. Okay, so some reactions break things down, other reactions build things. Now, what the word metabolism refers to, okay, we often think of metabolism as just the breakdown, but it's also the buildup. Metabolism refers to all the reactions inside the body, both the breaking down reactions, which we call catabolytic reactions or catabolism, and then the buildup reactions when we build things called anabolism. Okay, and those are the two types of reactions within inside metabolism, because metabolism is a very generic term. Okay, so this is just a kind of an idea. So the catabolism, when we're talking about catabolism, let me pick a better highlighter here. We're talking about catabolism, we're talking about you're taking a large molecule, a complex molecule, and you're breaking it down into smaller subunits. And when you do that, you release energy. Okay, so when you take something complex and you break it down, you release energy. Something like when we eat glucose, which is complex, and we break it down, okay, into like the carbons and the hydrogens and so on and so forth, it releases energy. Now, conversely, we have other types of reaction called anabolism, and that's where you take smaller subunits. So, example, like all of our bases, A, G, C's, and G's, okay, that we've eaten from food, and we want to assemble them into our own DNA. We need energy to do that. Okay? So, when actually you build up a complex molecule, you need to input energy, and then when you break it down, you release energy. So, these two reactions basically work with each other. We use this reaction, catabolytic reactions, to basically create the energy needed for anabolytic reactions. Okay? All right, so kind of a key idea, and I kind of already mentioned it, is this second law of thermodynamics that creating something more complex than the original building materials requires the input of energy, okay, or an anabolic reaction. An example would be something like photosynthesis. Okay, if we take photosynthesis, we're going to take something like CO2. Let me pick a better color here. We take CO2, simple. We take water. Okay? These two simple things are going to be combined into glucose and oxygen gas. Well, in order to combine these two things and make something more complex, we need energy. And that's what the sunlight is. That's why photosynthesis requires sunlight. It's going to take these two simple things, CO2 and water, and combine them into something more complex. And if you make something more complex, you're going to need energy over here. Now, the exact opposite is if we take something complex, so if you take something complex like glucose, okay, and you break it into the building materials or something more simple, then you release the energy, and that's catabolic reactions. So an example would be cellular respiration, because cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. We take glucose, complex, okay, we require oxygen. We don't require any energy, though. Okay? All we need to do, this is actually going to release energy. So when glucose breaks down into something simpler, like CO2 and water, because it's now broken down into a simpler molecule, energy is released. Okay? So when you build something complex, you need energy. When you break something down, you don't need any energy. It's a universal law across all of the universe. So it's the idea of if you want something to be organized, you got to put effort in. Okay, that's why subjects are hard. In order to be organized, you got to put effort in. It's very easy to be disorganized. Okay, it won't take a lot of effort, say, for your room to be messy, but it takes a lot of effort to make your room to be tidy. You back here, this idea: glucose combined with oxygen leads to CO2, H2O, and energy. Now there is some things that don't breathe in oxygen, but they still use glucose. It's just a modified way of using it. Organization takes energy. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the type of reactions that create energy called catabolic reactions. Okay, these are the ones that are going to create energy, something like cellular respiration. Okay, so in Unit 1, we discussed that one of the roles of macromolecules was to be converted into energy for the body. And so all living things require energy in order to survive. It's a requirement for living things. You need energy. And this energy is difficult to store and must be made continuously. We don't have little kind of batteries inside our body where we can just kind of store energy for a long period of time. It's not like that. It's something that needs to be continuously made. Okay? And we only make energy when we need it. We don't make it and store it. We just only make what we need. Okay? Now, all living things, including plants, which are sometimes surprising, create energy through a very important process called cellular respiration. Every living thing uses cellular respiration, that kind of form of process. So cellular respiration essentially turns macromolecules into usable energy for the body, and that usable energy is called ATP. We encountered it when we talked about secondary active transport. That's the energy that we can use. Okay? When we say food, food is stored energy, okay? But it's not usable energy. The usable energy inside our body is called ATP. Food can be converted to ATP. All right, so why do we have catabolic reactions in our body? Like, what are we using them for? Okay, if we're going to use these reactions to create energy, what do we need the energy for? Okay? So we need to provide energy to those reactions requiring it, like anabolic reactions. That's one of the reasons why we even have catabolic reactions, is you produce the energy from the reaction, which is then used by another reaction to actually perform it, an anabolic reaction. So that's one reason that we do it. Okay? So we burn, say, we will eat some food in order to have the energy to create new cells. Okay? Now, the other reason why we perform catabolic reaction is to create heat inside the body, which is required for reactions to take place. So we sometimes do a reaction, a catabolic reaction, just to take that energy and heat our bodies. Okay? Warm-blooded animals like us and birds and mammals require way more food than cold-blooded animals. If you're a cold-blooded animal like a reptile and amphibian, you don't need to eat very often. You don't eat regularly like we do. Anything that's warm-blooded, like a bird or a mammal, usually eats on a regular basis, like every day, every couple days. Maybe there's a few animals that eat maybe once a week. But nothing like amphibians or reptiles or some fish that are cold-blooded, and they don't need to do this whole thing. Okay? If you're a cold-blooded animal, you don't need to be doing this. So because you don't need to be doing this, you don't need to have your metabolism as high. You don't need to be eating as much food. So certain sharks, say, will eat twice a year. They only need to eat twice a year because they're cold-blooded. Okay? Anything warm-blooded needs to eat a lot more regularly. Okay? And then the main purpose of catabolic reactions, I mean, it ties into both of these two things, is this idea: to produce a usable form of energy in the body, ATP. And that's the main purpose of catabolic reactions. Okay, so the main catabolic reaction inside our body, the main one that we do, is called aerobic cellular respiration. Okay? Now, it's cellular respiration, but we have this word aerobic in front of it. And what that aerobic means is that we're using oxygen gas when we're performing this reaction. So we're taking glucose, okay, which we eat in food, oxygen, which we breathe in. We perform the reaction inside our body, and then after the reaction is done, we expel, okay, carbon dioxide, water, and then we use that energy for a variety of purposes. So just that term aerobic refers to the fact that oxygen is present, during this reaction. Okay? And this is the process that makes the max amount of energy. Okay, this is the process, unless you're exercising right now while you're watching my video, this is the process that you're doing, aerobic respiration. It's what we do most of the time. Okay? Now, there is certain times when the body loses oxygen, it doesn't have enough oxygen, and then we switch over. We still want to make energy, but we can't make it the most efficient way. We have to use it called anaerobic cellular respiration. And I'll pick a different color here. In an anaerobic cellular respiration, okay, that means that there is no oxygen. You don't have any oxygen to perform the process. So it's simply glucose. Instead of glucose plus oxygen, it says glucose gets turned into carbon dioxide, okay? A little bit of energy, not as much as if you actually used oxygen, but this is the problem right here. I'm going to highlight this in red. Is if you do it without oxygen, you produce nasty byproducts in the form of either lactic acid or ethanol. Usually not both. Depending on what kind of thing you're talking about, it will produce lactic acid or ethanol if you try and burn glucose without oxygen. So anaerobic refers to the fact that oxygen was not present during the reaction, creating less energy and the toxic byproducts of lactic acid and ethanol. And so we're through those coming up. So the first thing we're going to go through is aerobic cellular respiration. So aerobic cellular respiration is the good kind. Okay, this is the kind that you want to be doing. You're creating maximum amounts of energy. It's the most efficient. It means that you have oxygen gas, so you're breathing in enough oxygen to perform this reaction. So aerobic refers to the fact that oxygen is present for the reaction. Max energy is created. It creates way more energy than anaerobic. You can't even survive on anaerobic, okay, because it doesn't create enough energy. Aerobic produces a ton. Okay? So it's required to be running at all times in the brain, or death occurs. If you stop aerobic respiration inside the brain, that's what death is. Okay, that's what the definition of clinical death is when your brain stops functioning. In order for your brain to stop functioning, it's when it loses energy and you have stopped this process. Okay? So the only way death for it to occur is through brain cells to stop this process. All deaths, whether you have a heart attack, stroke, a gunshot wound, stab wound, you're all dying because your brain is stopping this process right here. That's what clinical death is. Okay? And now, when we look at this, we're saying glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water. We're really, really simplifying it because it actually contains a number of intermediate steps that we're going to go through. Now, if we were in actual class, we'd go through this a lot more in depth. We're going to keep it really high level, okay? And this is the steps that it goes through. You're going to have to know 4 steps, okay? 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's go through this. Okay. This is the overall process from beginning to end. Okay, this is what we're starting with, and this is what we're ending with. Okay, but we're going to talk about some of the intermediate steps on what happens as this full reaction happens. So the first thing that happens is what we call glycolysis. So what you're going to have is you're going to have glucose. So we're going to assume that all your food is glucose. So you're eating carbohydrates, which come from plants. Okay, you can't really get carbohydrates from animals, with the exception of milk. But all of our carbohydrates come from plants. Okay, and we all evolved to eat plants. So this whole system is based around eating carbohydrates. So you take in some glucose or any kind of carbohydrate that gets converted to glucose. Okay? The first thing that's happened is you're going to take this glucose, and which is a 6-carbon sugar, and it's going to be converted into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvates. So you go glucose gets converted to pyruvate. Okay? So the process of glycolysis turns glucose into pyruvate. Now, since you're going from a 6-carbon complex molecule into 2 smaller molecules, energy gets released. Since a larger one goes into a smaller one, a very small amount of ATP comes out, and that's what I've highlighted there. So we make a little bit of energy when we split glucose into pyruvate, okay, but not very much. Okay. Now, after we have pyruvate, so now we have pyruvate, and if you look at my kind of diagram on the side, now we're at pyruvate. The next step is going to be convert pyruvate into another molecule called acetyl-CoA. And we call that step pyruvate oxidation. So what's going to happen now is each pyruvate, which is each 3 carbons, is then converted into a smaller molecule, even simpler than pyruvate, called acetyl-CoA. And it's only 2 carbons. Okay? So since we went from a 3-carbon molecule to a 2-carbon molecule, where did that carbon go? Well, it went off as CO2, and we breathe that out. Okay? So we've now gone from glucose to pyruvate to now acetyl-CoA. Okay. Now it's time for step 3. We go into the Krebs cycle. And if you take biology in university, you'll become very familiar with this Krebs cycle because we're just calling it the Krebs cycle right now, but in university you'll have to go through all the steps. So what happens is the acetyl-CoA enters the Krebs cycle, goes through a whole series of reactions where it basically prepares them to go into the last stage. And the last stage is where all of our energy is made. Okay? It's called the ETC, or electron transport chain. And here, a series of redox reactions is when most of the energy gets made. Okay? And water comes off as a byproduct. So we go from glucose, okay, I'll highlight this, we go from glucose to pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Okay? Acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle prepares the acetyl-CoA to go into the final stage, which is the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain takes those acetyl-CoAs that have been prepped in the Krebs cycle and then just produces a ton of ATP. And this last stage is when most of the energy comes out. Okay, this is where we make most of our energy, is in this very last stage, the electron transport chain. Okay, so that's the process of aerobic cellular respiration. That's the ideal way of creating energy in our body. Now, where is this happening? Okay, so where it happens, remember we have glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. It basically happens inside a cell. Now, most of the process where we're going to create all the energy happens in the mitochondria. And remember, you call those the power plants of the cell. And why they're the power plants of the cell is where they create most of the energy. But this whole process doesn't happen inside the cell. Okay? I'm going to use my highlighter to kind of illustrate. Glycolysis and pyruvate oxidation, the first two steps, happens outside the mitochondria, just in the cytoplasm, so just regularly in the cell. And then once you have acetyl-CoA, now you start going into the mitochondria, and then the last two stages happen inside the mitochondria, where most energy is made. All right. Now, the last thing to talk about is we said, okay, well, glucose. We're going to burn glucose for foods. And when we burn glucose for foods or any kind of carbohydrate, we get this perfect series where we go through glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. That's the perfect thing if you're going to burn a carbohydrate. But we don't just burn carbohydrates. Okay? We burn other things too, like we can take fat and we can make energy out of it, or we can do protein. But if you remember, carbohydrates are the instant energy. And why we call it instant energy is it's already ready to go into this process to make energy. And that's why it's instant. You don't need to do any processing of the carbohydrate. Okay? If it's a polysaccharide, you may have to break them down into the individual carbohydrates, and that's why polys are medium stored. But carbohydrates have been designed for this process, so they can just jump into the reaction, go through, and make a bunch of ATP. Now, fats, we can also get energy from, but fats need to be processed a little bit before. Carbohydrates don't. So fats, you need to basically tear them apart into the glycerol and then into the fatty acid part. And once you've ripped them apart, then they enter in the chain, but they don't enter in the chain at the very beginning. They enter them in kind of halfway through. And that's why fats take longer to give us energy. They will give us energy, but they won't give us instant energy because you have to do this processing. You've got to break them apart and then enter them into the cycle in different spots. Same with protein. Okay, protein will also give us energy, even though we don't very rarely will burn protein for energy. We mostly just use carbohydrates and fats. You can do protein as well, but the same problem that fat has, protein has. You got to go through and you got to rip apart all the amino acids, and then some amino acids go in here, some ones go in here, and some one go at this point. So you don't get maximum ATP because you're not doing the entire process when you use proteins and fats. Okay. So we can, use all of our different foods to bring them in, and they all use cellular respiration, but they enter in the pathway at different points. Okay, so our next lesson is going to be on what if you don't have oxygen? Okay, how do you do anaerobic respiration?